Hello and a warm welcome to everyone joining us for Psychosocial Wednesday today. We hope you had a wonderful summer and all are set for the second part of this season of Psychosocial Wednesdays. Bernard, Stefano, and I want to thank the IAAP for their support and Instituto Freedom in Brazil for producing the 7th edition of our webinar this year. I'm just looking for the globe, so
just a minute, Ludmila, because I'm going to tell to the Brazilian audience the instructions, and then she will activate the globe.
Okay.
Então, boa tarde. Agora eu estou um pouco traduzindo o que a Ludmila acabou de falar. Bem-vindos de volta de todos, né, essa tarde para a Psychosocial Wednesdays, quartas-feiras psicossociais, onde hoje nós vamos ter a apresentação da Carmen e do Guilherme em português e será traduzido para o inglês. Para que as pessoas, os brasileiros, as pessoas que vão trabalhar com a língua em português, que precisem em algum momento da tradução simultânea, daqui a pouquinho vai ser ativada a tradução simultânea e vocês vão ver um ícone na forma do globo. Cliquem ali e escolham português. Vocês vão ouvir tudo em português, né? Como a Ludmila disse, já em inglês, eu não preciso repetir. For the ones who would like to listen in English, please click on the globe and choose English, ok? E esse evento está sendo gravado e depois será disponibilizado no YouTube, ok? Vamos lá, pode ativar, Beatriz.
There it is. I wait a second so everyone can click Portuguese or English. Okay, in a moment, I will introduce our speakers today. We have two this time, but first I'd like to bring to your attention this printed publication. This is Jungian Yearbook. It offers a unique blend of content, including papers, poetry, and rites de sortie, providing a platform for individuals to contribute pieces informed by analytical psychology and neo-Jungian studies. It serves as a thought-provoking resource, enriching the Jungian community's perspectives. The 2022 edition of Jungian Yearbook, which looks like this, explores a diverse range of themes, from the Russian invasion of Ukraine to cultural complexes in Israel, Shakespearean concepts, AIDS, transgender individuation, personal reflections on the Yom Kippur War, and much more. I will share a link with more information in the chat shortly, but I'd also like to mention that Jungianeum, brought to life by Stefano Carpani, encompasses various initiatives. For example, this yearbook, which was published for the first time this year. There are talks, like also Psychosocial Wednesdays, masterclasses, a book series called Recovered, and partnerships like the recent collaboration with Pacifica Graduate Institute in San Francisco, which launched a graduate certificate course last weekend. These efforts under the umbrella of Jungianeum aim to enhance the visibility and impact of Jung's psychology, both in individual therapy and in shaping societal policies and perspectives. So that a bit as a side note, but now to today's topic. Carmen, Livia, Parise, and Guilherme Scandiucci will talk about the power of listening. Carmen, Livia, Parise works as a clinical psychologist and analyst for various organizations such as the IJUSP, the AJB, and the IAAP. Additionally, she serves as the administrative director of the IJUSP, co-coordinator of ARCHE, the nucleus of archetypal psychology of IJUSP, USP, and the Department of Sexual Diversity and Gender of AJB. Furthermore, Carmen is a member of Collettivo Aesthesis. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Then we have Guilherme Scandiucci. He earned a degree in psychology from the University of Sao Paulo, as well as an MA in Jungian and post-Jungian studies from the University of Essex. He also holds a master's degree in school psychology and human development, and a PhD as well in school psychology and human development, both from the University of Sao Paulo. Guilherme is now a professor at the Pontifical Catholic University of Sao Paulo, having graduated in psychology. He operates as a psychotherapist at a private clinic.
Einen Ort für dich suchen, wenn ich war.
That was Siri, I apologize. He possesses expertise in psychology with particular focus on subjects such as analytical psychology, cultural complexes, racism, urban environments, and contemporary clinic. So much for the biographies. Now, the title of today's presentation is The Power of Listening, a neo-Jungian approach to clinical psychology and cultural complexes. The two presenters call for psychoanalysts to engage with emerging minority issues by expanding traditional analytical psychology. They emphasize the need to address marginalized groups and discuss racism within analytical psychology and social sciences. Their goal is to promote a more inclusive approach by exploring different cultures and perspective in the field. So Carmen, Guilherme, it is your turn now. For everybody else, after the presentation, there will be time and space for comments and questions. Enjoy.
Olá, obrigada, Ludmila. Então, queria começar.
Thank you, Ludmila. I'd like to start thanking Ludmila and Stefano for the invitation. It's an honor to be here with you, talking about such a dear topic, which we are studying for a long time. And I'd like also to thank Institute of Freedom, Freedom Institute, to make it available for the Brazilian audience. So I'm going to start because we have a lot of things to talk about. And we are going to speak in Portuguese. We also thank Freedom Institute for making available translation, simultaneous translation. So the topic that we brought today is the power of listening, a neo-Jungian approach to clinical psychology and cultural complexes. Just a minute, because okay, now it's working. So I'd like to start by telling you that this topic has been emerging to us through a supervision group that we had with some Brazilian colleagues, and that we saw that these groups were being populated by issues regarding especially the oppressions, sexual oppressions, gender oppressions. And we started to analyze that our theoretical framework wasn't enough. It was lacking something. I enjoy talking about something that it was a question that was always present in our clinic, in our WhatsApps, in our telephone, because a lot of Black people, the Black population, or with girlfriends or boyfriends or friends, or the Black friends of the Black population, they used to call us and ask us, do you have a Black analyst to indicate to us? So this was followed by reports of previous stories and experience with white analysts that weren't very successful because the Black person didn't feel that was really heard by this white analyst. And many times it was followed by stories that these people were finding more hearing in social movements or in the religious institutions. So we are making it clear that we don't think that therapy is the only place that soul can be made. We think that there are many places. Of course, we want to have more Black analysts, but these requests captured our attention to an issue. What's the suffering that we, white analysts, are not being able to listen to? Why and where our listening fails? So we also noticed that we had few Black colleagues to indicate, and how come we didn't notice this fact before? So would it have gender, the complex, would it have gender, color, or social class? Wouldn't it be the same for all people? Even if the analytical psychology has been constructed directly in a very solid and consistent base influenced by the romanticism of the 19th century, I think that the transformation and the passing to the 20th and 21st century started to review this theoretical framework. So one of the things that we perceived, one of the problematic issues here was this false dichotomy that inhabits among Jungians, as we have a psyche that was in our inner world, governed by the archetypes and the complexes arising from these complex, versus social and historical life outside, with no relation with this inner world. Right? And even it can disturb this inner world. So the analytical psychology is ambiguous regarding this, because from one side, we have the individuation that requires an adaptation to the outer world. Sometimes we see some Jungians talking about the mass and group situation as something that would disturb the individuation. So one of the things that we thought is that if the psyche is speaking through the symptoms that it produces, at the beginning of the psychology in the 19th century, the psyche were talking through the hysterics and schizophrenics in the Society of Reason, but in the private rooms. So couldn't it awake a fantasy that the psyche is private, individual, that the unconscious is inside the psyche and the psyche is inside this individual? Jung's complex theory was restricted to individuals, we can say, even if he had a sensibility to the environment where the individuals were inserted. I think that he studied not as much this relationship. So the perception of this gap, of this dichotomy, is not something that is happening today. A lot of people have been studying this to, of course, try to fill this gap. I'm not going to study all of them because we don't have time, but just to remind you how this has been developed in the analytical psychology. We have to remember 1962, Joseph Henderson was thinking about the cultural unconscious already, would be the layer of the collective unconscious where all historical members would be stored and which would express part of the culture. In 1995, Michael Van Noy Adams will bring the idea of this stereotypical collective layer in composition with another layer, which is archetypal. So this layer is formed, of course, by the accumulation of historical and cultural data. And it seems so natural that it seems innate. So this layer would influence our perceptions of the world that surrounds us. In 2000, Thomas Singer, Samuel Peebles bring the ideas. Thomas Singer has a lot of contribution, and they really promote and work on this idea, which is the idea of the cultural complexes. Guilherme is going to talk about this a little bit more, but here I would like to remind you that this cultural complex would come from this cultural unconscious, and that they would be interacting with the archetypal and the personal layer and with the external reality. And from this, they would form what be the basis of our perceptions, like the personal complexes, but both of the collective psyche and the individual psyche. So we are going to find out that the cultural complex is going to be this theoretical device that will really legitimize all these things that we are submitted to and that really trespasses us. So based on this is going to try to pull us out of this dichotomy. From one side, we have the archetypes as the latent realm of all possibilities inherent in universal themes. On the other side, we will need history and culture to express these possibilities. So history and culture would provide the archetypal images that would individuate between each of these archetypes. If it is this way, it's evident the need to listen, to hear, and to know the plurality of the substrate that permeate the narratives that reach us. And will also ask from us, the importance of this is that it has two main functions to know more about the substrates. One is that we have to have more awareness of the role of the cultural complexes, of the prejudices, of stereotypes and anachronisms that, of course, will hurt our imaginations and also the fictions of the patients when they arrive in our room. And the other idea is, of course, to enhance our imaginative repertoire. So, of course, this active imagination is to enter and to be entered. So the clinic needs the encounter of these many voices that consistently visit us and the voices of our patients. I think these minorities, they are requesting more places of speech. They are requesting these places. And this also, of course, invites us to make an honest criticism of how we are honest critic of our way of being in this world. Because the idea is that when we universalize the idea of humanity as an European, white, imperialist, heteronormative model, of course, that we create subhumanities. And the importance of this in the clinic is that we try to adapt all narratives to something that we already know. So we risk erasing these existences in the way they are presented. So I'd like to say that in this point, the social movements, they have a lot to teach us, as if these other ideas could be thought and lived with the legitimizing force of the collectivity. So this makes us think and wonder that in these social movements, we can see in a certain way and how we can bring this to the clinic, there is a spontaneous social clinic happening. So how about the clinical work? Just to review. So there are other ideas ask for a place of speech. And in this way, we are invited to individualize the listening, sophisticate and expand it, turn it plural. And to do it, we have to be conscious. We have to have a critical awareness of analysts about themselves, right? In this way, it was present in an intuitive way. We have in the practice of psychotherapy, where he's going to say this: the more knowledge penetrates into the essence of the psyche, the greater becomes the conviction that the multiplicity of stratifications and the varieties of the human being also require a variety of points of view and methods, so that the diversity of psychic disposition is satisfied. This is in the practice of psychotherapy. And another point that we like to bring is the encounter of the other needs to be really done. But we have to pay attention in this point. We have to be careful so as not to colonize the other. I'm going to bring this expression. And what would be this? So I like to bring also to explain better the concept of integration, because we have to be careful, because the integration cannot be made in the sense of to translate the other with the thinking categories that we already have, because we can be erasing other logics and other ways of being, other ways of expressing gender, sexuality, other ethical orders. So this was a concept that we were paying more attention. And it's present also in the new anthropology. It will say that it will not be the integration, but the confrontation, the friction among ontologies between differences that will allow us the political imagination of other possible words. This is also in the Jungian theory, when Jung is talking about the individuation, that he's going to say that it's the friction between opposites that will be responsible for the psych work of individuation, tertium non datum, a new order. So I'm also going to take a theoretical license, but not the friction of opposites, but the friction between difference. I think that this is a little bit of a difference that I will go back to it at the end. And also to bring this idea that maybe what we need is a porous listening that really allows the transpassing, right? So allows oneself to be penetrated and affected by the other without imprisoning the other. So another point that I think we can highlight here is that as long as we do not validate the cultural aspect as a foundation, as well as the archetypal, I think it's interesting to think if we wouldn't be producing in the therapy a mode of subjectivation that promises an individual and hides cultural neuroses, an individual that it's equal him or themselves. So the production of differences of the variables that inhabit us, maybe we are going to have this sensible point. And another point that I think it's as important as the first one is that if this device, the therapy, wouldn't be producing some cultural neuroses and hiding cultural neuroses, because we are deviating the norm, because the individualities, they don't contain. So necessarily, we are going to produce some failures. But if we take these failures and produce bodies and call these bodies failures, what kind of ethics are we producing? So based on this thought, we arrived to the conclusion that the vitality of a contemporary Jungian clinic will be fed by the displacement of the modern and unilateral European notion of a transcendent self-knowledge and enclosed in the subjectivity to an outer knowledge that is directed to an animistic word that is in relation with the subject all the time, producing ways of being. And the idea that a clinic needs to meet the fragmentation, not to find the synthesis, this individual, but to meet the fragmentation, there's many places and voices that visit us, that arrive to us through our patients. And also I evoke here Hillman. He will bring the idea that the boundaries of the soul are uncertain, and the locus of psychological work concerns this place of relationship between us and the world. This is where it's going to have this live processes that will come to our clinic. So the locus of this therapy would be beyond our notions of individuality. Another idea that Hillman brings is that the idea that the soul seeks for its community, to be made. So this would necessarily include bringing the world around us into our workplaces. So to bring this world around inside the skin and vice versa. So now I'm going to pass the floor to Guilherme, and then I'll come back here. Okay, let's go. So I'd like to thank Ludmila, Stefano, and the translation, Luciana, for Freedom Institute, for promoting, and everyone that is present here. Now, we are going to enter in something more specific after the introduction that Carmen made, which I think that it's an issue that we understand as very important and present and fundamental for us as society, not only as a Brazilian society. I think that in one way or another, it affects the whole world. But in our context in Brazil, that's where we are going to talk. So I'm going to talk about some issues that I think that it's important, especially for the ones that are here that are not from Brazil, which is the racial issues in Brazil. Of course, and I'm talking as a white person. This is the place where I'm speaking from, this whiteness and how the whiteness operates in Brazil. And of course, I'm going to try to make a connection with the cultural complexes and other ideas of the analytical psychology framework. And bringing some examples and also some clinical examples and how this works and operates in the therapeutic work. So generally, when we start talking about the racism in Brazil, we can start by saying that it's not a moral issue. It's not simply a moral issue. One person subjects the other directly and how this affects us morally. I think that is something that is a little bit more present and why in the society. There is a terminology being used recently, which is the structural racism, that for many authors, this kind of racism is the pillar of our society, a foundation. It's something that really founds us as society that was colonized by the Portuguese and then suffered a lot of processes of colonization. Maybe the worst would be the African people slavery. So some people call it a racist colonial project, which passes through the disqualification of the symbolic elements that make up non-white cultures, the elements that crossed the Atlantic Ocean, coming from the African people, or the ones that were already here for many centuries, the indigenous people, the original people, and they tend to be disqualified as the way of thinking and of doing from the European people and of the whole Western people prevails. So, firstly, we already lose a lot of things in the first moments of colonization. There is an expression which is used also with the ontological semiocide, right, with the extermination of the meaning of the other, of the way of the comprehension of life of the other. And what we also call and see a lot in these studies is the plantation type colonization, which is at the same time literal and metaphorical. The colonization is to eliminate the diversity in some areas and to promote monoculture, monoplantation, like the sugarcane, coffee, and other products, at least here in Brazil as a colony. But the plantation time colonization was also a monoculture in the sense of the cultures that were here and prevail, exterminating the others. And also, of course, the development of the metropolis, in our case, Portugal. So the colonized lands at the same time generate profit, and at the same time is where less privileged people will go to live. So also the idea of race, many times we put it between ashes because there is no biological perspective in this concept of race. But since this is something that is still present, we still use this expression race, which means a kind of a phenotype that would be established by the skin color and that determines or suggests moral and intellectual characteristics due to this kind of a projective matter. So you imagine that a Black person will have some characteristics, and this is a discourse that we see since the beginning. So we also have here some data, some information that I think it's part of what we are bringing, and the effort, it's part of the efforts that we are making to understand this issue of the racism in Brazil. Now, okay, so okay. So today in Brazil, according to our Institute of Demographic Institute, we have 80% of the population is considered Black or of Black origin or of non-white. 75%, 56% of Blacks, Indigenous and people of color. 75 of those living below the poverty line. Less than 30% of leaders in national companies are Black. 67% of the prison contingent is Black. 75% of the children and adolescents aged between 10 and 19 who are victims of homicide are Black. 75 of those killed by the police are Black. This is a very important data. And 76% of victims of violent deaths are Black. As we are saying here, race is a potent fuel for producing asymmetries. Brazil is a country, for the ones that are outside of the Brazilian context, Brazil is a country in which the issue of the subjugation of the Black people is very strong. Even if it's been discussing in the last
passam a acontecer de maneira mais veemente,
and the political actions, they are being more present in the last decades. We are a very unequal country. We have one of the greatest percentages of inequalities here in Brazil. And this characteristic is very, very present, very strong in Brazil, because most of the positions of any kind of power leadership is concentrated in the hands of white people. So we are going to bring some authors that we think that there are some interesting ideas in the social psychology, starting by Maria Parecida Bento. Cida Bento is an author working in social psychology, a Black woman. And she uses the expression narcissistic pact of whiteness. This is a very interesting expression that is going to be characterized by the silencing of whites on the racial issue, right? Like the whites, they keep try to maintain the privileged position, making a pact of silence and exclusion that sometimes is not so visible and so notoriously aggressive, but all the time protecting this pact, presenting themselves as more integrated people in the society. As she defines, they are unconscious intergroup alliances characterized by ambiguity and, with regard to racism, by the interdiction of Black people in spaces of power, by the permanent effort of moral, affective, economic, and political exclusion of Black people in the social world. So the project of this pact is to exclude the Black people from the spaces of power. This is the pact between the whites of whiteness. So we are discussing at this moment the indication for our Supreme Court. Some Black politicians, they are, of course, trying to indicate a Black woman for the Supreme Court, because one of them, they're going to retire. And there is a discussion right now that they should put another woman, and preferably a Black woman, because there was never a Black woman in the Supreme Court here in Brazil. So, closing the parentheses, another affirmation here. We can go ahead. Okay. The systematic genocide of the Black population has been representing this death policy that is, above all, an attack on democracy in Brazil, on the democratic state, and is engendered within the institutions that constitute Brazilian society. So this is quoting Cida Bento, and also quoting Angela Davis. It's not individual people who decide that violence is the answer. It is the institutions around us that are saturated with violence, teaches us Angela Davis. So a rapid definition of whiteness in the next slide. Whiteness, in its essence, concerns a set of cultural practices that are unnamed and unmarked. That is, there is a silence and concealment around these cultural practices. Ruth Frankenberg draws attention to whiteness as a position of structural advantage, of racial privileges. It's a point of view, a place from which white people look at themselves, others, and society. So whiteness is mainly in these places, and sometimes it can seem subtle, but at the same time, they are completely excluding. The social mechanisms works in a way of not excluding the white population, excluding the Black population. It's not very difficult. In myself, in my case, for example, to observe this, for example, my transit, the way I transit here in São Paulo is a lot, it's less difficult than a Black person transiting in São Paulo. Okay, I'm not checked by the police. I'm not followed if I enter a supermarket or a grocery store, department store. So this is a whiteness pact. The policeman or the police looks at me and say, okay, he's white. Let's not touch him. Okay. So going ahead, another very important author for us that has been discussing this issue is Leah Schuckman, a white Jewish woman that is going to remind us that this idea, and she has a research in her PhD research in this, is that the whites have no race, that the whites will be the universal subject, and that the standard of humanity, the others are different. Black are different, Indigenous are different. And she's going to question, when was race an issue for the white? When did we think about what it means to be white? He uses a very interesting example. When we think of ethnic clothing, why do we think of Asian and African clothing, but never suits and ties? Nobody talks about, well, I'm going to look at this universal clothing. Okay, so of course, by this idea, so the whiteness in the Western world would indicate moral, intellectual, and aesthetic superiority. So the idea that it's not enough to be racist. We need to have daily practices. It's not enough to be not to be racist, but we need daily actions of anti-racism. So we have here Michael Van Noy Adams. So in the international Jungian field, I think that the majority of you knows, but he is going to present the racial issue as something that is very marking in his book from the 90s. In the Jungian field, is going to talk about the raciality of the unconscious. Race is something as important as sexuality. Is going to discuss some clinical cases. It's a mock in this Jungian field. Michael Van Adams, a North American author and Jungian analyst. And afterwards, the cultural complexes that Carmen has already mentioned before, Kimball and Singer, they are going to bring, that I imagine, of course, you already have an idea of their work, obviously inspired in the idea of the complex that comes from Jung, being, of course, brought to the collective, to the historical, to the cultural environment, and how do they relate to each other, and how this operates and constitutes the individual, and also the way the group operates. So basically, and trying to synthesize in a very rough way, that's what they are going to study, that's what they are going to put and to name as cultural complexes. And we are bringing this expression here to our presentation. The stereotype issues, but also the belonging issues, as Jung used to put, like the complex is not pathological and shadowing. The complex is also a fragmentation that helps us in the psychic organization, since it's not completely dominated by the other complexes. So we are facing something that really can be imported or can result in violence, for example. I don't know if I'm speaking too fast. I hope it's okay. I'm being pressured by Kronos, so. And of course, we have Fanny Brewster, another North American author that she has been producing a lot of things in this field and talking about the racial complex. She's going to bring an idea that for me it was very important to reflect about in the book Live in the Shadow. If I'm not mistaken, it's a book, Live in the Shadows. So she's going to think in this book, among other things, on how, even if Jung uses epistemological basis outside of the European universe, as you know, he had an anthropological interest towards other cultures. It would be difficult to affirm that Jung is an experimental positivist author. It's enough to think of the idea of the participation mystique that he borrows this idea, but he uses this in the transference process. So these are ideas to think the unconscious in a way that goes beyond the positivistic epistemology. But it's not well acknowledged. The origins, also African or even indigenous, of the Jungian ideas are not very well acknowledged as such. So the Black is going to be still seen as strange as the other, as the primitive. Jung has a lot of complicated texts in this sense. So Fanny talks about this in the book, about the Jungian language. I think that in her recent book, Archetypal Grief, is going to talk about the intergenerational effects of the trauma of the enslaved women, that this has a very, very important relationship with us. And just to conclude very rapidly, how much time do I still have?
Acho que temos uns 15.
I think we have still 15 minutes,
Yeah,
but you
15.
need, I need 10 minutes. So in 5 minutes now, I'm just going to talk rapidly. It's a case study. I think it's the next slide. I think it's just a briefing about a patient that I had some years ago. I call her Anna. Of course, it's not her real name. Was a Black woman, 30 years old. She worked in a big multinational company, and she comes with a complaint, difficulty in trusting people and relating emotionally, a difficulty in establishing affection, romantic, love relationships. So she doesn't make big investments in the partners with whom she eventually meets. She's a heterosexual woman. So these men, they don't have the characteristics that she expects from a man. This is what she brings initially. In a brief way, authoritarian father, little encourager, that practically abandoned the family when he divorced her mother and he married another woman. She had a brother. I think that she was 10 years old when they separate, when the parents separate. And of course, the father was the one that provided to the family, so they faced a lot of financial difficulties. So the father was a person that she felt kind of anger towards him. And one of the things that I'd like to discuss here is that I thought, working with her, it was very difficult to see in a private clinic in the city of São Paulo, a Black person that is really still with a very, very dark skin, because her father was an African. So I used to look at her and I used to think that she had an exotic beauty. I know there is prejudice in this, but that's what came to my mind. And we have to work with what comes to our mind. And she was always very discreetly and elegantly dressed. She used to speak formally, in a formal way. And I started to realize in the cultural complex that was present in the choices, in her choices. And she took a long time to start talking about the racial issue. It came mainly after, a lot after, a lot of sessions were needed before touching this subject. And we were perceiving that to escape from this stereotype of essential Black woman, a samba dancer with an excess, with a sexual appetite, a big sexual appetite, she created this stereotype. So there is a resonance that has to do, that will touch the personal complex in relation to the father and to traumas, earlier traumas, but also the cultural, because there is a projective charge towards a Black person that uses to live and to stay surrounded by white people. So this is going to manifest in her way of dealing, of allowing an emotional and affectionate relationship. So this cultural complex and this individual complex unite as forces in the construction of these neuroses. So that's it. I concluded. Go, Lily. Okay. So now I'd like to bring another author that also worked this issue of the racism, James Hillman. The ones that didn't have the opportunity, I recommend the notes on the white supremacy. I'm not going to explore too much here, but I'd like to touch one aspect that he brought to go back to what I called about individuation in Jung, the idea of the opposites. So I'd like to start saying that racism for a human is psychologically grounded in oppositional thinking. Hume is going to say that when the whites arrive in Africa and name the black, the opposite of the white, at the same time, you put the whiteness in the Western and you put the black in the rest of the world, not because of the opposite, but it's because it's inherent in whiteness to think in opposites, to think based on opposites, right? And it's inherent in whiteness, not only this oppositional thinking, but also the supremacist thinking. One is the opposite of the other, and one is superior to the other. So to deepen this idea, Human is going to go to the root of the Indo-European word, Indo-European, to be clear, bright, shining, the white, right? We're talking about light, something that shines. The shadow of this consciousness is going to be white. And exactly because it's white, it's going to give the impression that there's no shadow. It's a conscience that operates in terms of light. So in white supremacy, the shadow is white, but it's still shadow. So what consists the shadow? The shadow here would be an excess of the presence of the good, this quality of consciousness that is operating all the time. And when the Europeans think and feel as being the chosen one, religiously and ethically, and to bring this Christian God to the rest of the world, and also to proceed with the advance of new cultural marks on the civilization scale, that they are doing good to the rest of these people that wouldn't have soul. But it's this, if there's all this good present here, something has to subvert this good. And this good is going to be projected in the other one that, of course, is going to subvert this white self. So Hillman invites us to look through this projection. If I have this fantasy as a white that the black person is going to cross the street and rob me, what is going to be robbed? He's going to rob this good. He would rob this the things. I think he makes a lot of reasoning about this, and I really suggest that you read. And he says that this white ego needs to metaphorically die. So if we enter this psychological dimension, perhaps we can free Black people from carrying the sociological shadow of primitiveness, because I subvert the primitiveness. And what I'm going to question is the developmentalist fantasy of the ego, of the white ego. Do we really have to develop and to at all costs? And do we think, and also to question the heroic force of the ego as the only driving force, and also the idea of inferiority, one is superior, the other is inferior. Isn't there a moral ethics that needs to be rethought this way? Also, to put this white in this white ego, other possibilities of colors, And also we could free ourselves from this limitation. Also the expansion of the ethnocentrism of the white to universal collective, and also to dying with it with variety, with challenge its superiority and tarnish its innocence, going from this one to this various possibility, what I brought in the beginning, to review our listening. So if we start to admit the multiple, the diverse, and the plural as founding conditions of the psyche, so we start to think from diversity instead of seeking an alleged unity. Hillman says that from this point of view, we would all be in the mind. So I would like to introduce you the Bantu ethnicity for the ones that don't know. This ethnicity is going to bring the same subject in another way, but it illustrates Hillman's thinking. For the ones that don't know, in Brazil, we had three between etches migratory people. We had the Yoruba, the Jeje, and the Bantu. Bantus would be the inhabitants of what we call today Angola, Congo, and Mozambique. So 75% of the enslaved Black people in Brazil were from this Bantu culture. So it was a culture that's still very present here. And Bantu is going to talk about the Moyo. Moyo is this vital force that keeps us alive. And this force is not permanent. It renews itself. It has to be fed. It has to be fed. So I have my moyo, you have your moyo, a culture has a moyo. This moyo is going to be fed in the meeting, in the encounter, when a culture encounters the other, a perspective of being, of existing through the crossroads, from the tension, from the affections that happen when two persons cross, when two cultures cross. So this idea that it's not one and the other in opposition, that there isn't an I, a me that annulates the other. There's the idea of the I. It's I am with the other. I am the other. So any idea of essence would be an illusion, because I would be a being that is available to the alterity, to the other, to the otherness, affected by love, by death, by affection, by life. So the Ubuntu philosophy is there is no individual that being with others, then no individual then being with others, and these others being related in a whole. So this meeting is what keeps the word and is the healing of the word. Remind you that this encounter is not something that is searching a unity, a harmony, a consensus. It's part to have the beating, the joy, the horror, the love, and of course, harmony. Everything is part of this. So just to conclude, I'd like to bring a case that I think it's interesting. I'm not going to talk if it's a Black man or a Black analyst, but I think this is important in other ways. As a man, I'm going to call him W. He's male, Caucasian, cisgender, 35 years old, and he comes for analysis because he works with logistic in multinational companies. He's very competent and well succeeded professionally, but it's always arrives a moment in the companies that he is accused by their boss that he doesn't have too much ambition, that he doesn't aspire to grow and to grow in the company. He didn't want to be a Latin American director because he wanted to be a father that could have lunch, that could pick his children in school. So he really enjoyed his work. But his greatest motivation was in managing a team, to see each one of this group grow professionally, helping them gain self-esteem. And he felt kind of inadequate, not belonging to this logic, or something that was expected from him. So he considered himself an introverted man. He was an introverted boy, focused on interpersonal relationships in the family, a father and other two male brothers that were extroverted and oriented more towards the masculine values, ambitious, workaholic. So he always felt a little bit inadequate. I just would like to tell you that at this moment, I was studying a lot about Bantu culture. There was a moment in which I thought about bringing to him this logics and to tell him what I was studying about. And it was something very important in this analytical process because it seems like it legitimated something in him, as if his head felt belong. So this promoted a change in the process of this patient. I wanted to bring this because I think that's a kind of patient that, of course, it's common to come uh, to our workplaces, that they don't find satisfaction in a world governed by prevailing law. The capital accumulation is a liability that makes no sense to them. Corporate competitiveness does not motivate them. So they feel wrong, they feel guilty, they feel inadequate, that is doing something wrong. And we work a lot this idea that maybe their work doesn't produce wealth, even if it produces a lot, but not this wealth that was expected. He would prefer that his colleague would feel better than to bring more profit or something like that. And maybe these men, they don't make the wheel of capitalism turn, but the actions, the values can have meaning to the community, to someone's dignity, for a community destiny. So this case, I wanted to bring to think about this, to to reveal this listening and also this plurality, and to listen to these different voices that are inside of us and of course inside our patients. So we thought about this proposition, something that we always insist. It's urgent to give voice to the word that was colonized, culturally and psychologically silent. In order for us to exist in all our vivacity and splendor, we would have to open the doors to the so-called interior and peripheral in order to imagine and build other ways of living, which include all our thoughts and possibilities, including, or perhaps mainly, those that have been denied, repressed, and neglected. This also made us think of a proposition that the clinic can work as imaginal quilombos, in the sense of breaking with a hegemonic capitalist imperative of function and understanding, and to give voice, to listen, legitimize all the voices that can inhabit us and that we inhabit. Besides that, three other conclusions would be that we don't see the Jungian theory not as universal and essentialized, but it's always in construction and individuation. Rethink and expand our theoretical framework, and consequently, to be careful and not to use Jung to colonize the logic of anyone. Okay, so we get out of the theoretical universalism that no longer fits. And of course, the importance to reassemble and update the plurality of the founding ancestry, not as something essential, but as an opening for the imaginative repertory. And in this sense, to keep on looking at these new becomings that are coming to our lives. Okay, the black, the yellow, the indigenous becoming. And at last, I'd like to bring this wonderful poet, Brazilian poet, that is Conceição Evaristo. She says, and I do believe, that our dreams protected through the sheets of the night, when they open one by one, on the clothesline of a new time, our tears flow, fertilizing the whole earth where black seeds resist, restoring hopes in us. That's it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Carmen. Thank you very much, Guilherme, for elaborating this topic, which I think is so in different intensities, omnipresent in all countries in the world, structural racism, its impact, cultural complexes. So thank you very much. Thank you also, Isa, for translating for the English-speaking community. For those who want to read more from Carmen and Guilherme, this is what their book looks like. Reimaginando lugar de escutar, I think more or less pronounced correctly. So far, I think only in Portuguese available, or yeah.
Yeah, so far only Portuguese.
Okay. Now it's time for questions, comments. You can raise either your digital hand or write something in the comment section. And here I would invite Isa to help me. If there are questions in Portuguese. So feel free to ask. Don't be shy. Words of affirmation so far. Carmen, if nobody comes forward for now, I just want to pick up on a term, Carmen, you used, the porous listening. Could you, for me as a layperson, say a bit more about this technique, this concept of porous listening? Where does it come from? Where does it go?
Bom, vou começar
Well,
aqui, tá?
I'm going to start, okay, Gui?
Na verdade, esse foi conceito que a gente
So this was a concept that we invented, searching for a metaphor for what we were trying to say, to express. It is listening, to be available to what the other brings without rapidly translating to something that it's already known by us. For example, something that we see a lot here in Brazil, I don't know, in the other countries, and people look at the native figure of the shaman and they translate him as a psychotherapist. And investigating more the ontologies, we thought that it's a little bit risky to have this direct translation because there are many different specificities, different functions. There is a relationship with the nature involved that it's completely different. So we started notice how risky it was to listen to the other and immediately translate to an idea, a figure that we already know. So instead of that, wouldn't it be different? Wouldn't it be better to ask more, to highlight the differences instead of translating to what we know, and to try to understand more specifically the image that the person is bringing, from which quality this person is speaking from. The porous listening allows to be affected by what is brought without immediately translating to something that we already know. Okay, I know what it is, because it's more comfortable, but maybe we are losing the image of the different at this moment. We are trying to capture humans' idea of to precise the image. As much precise it is, how much you enter the image, deeper you are going and more you cultivate the soul that this image is trying to show you. Because there are logics that are different from the ones that we are used to operate with. So Bantu, for me, the idea of the Bantu people is completely different. How this encounter operates, what's the result of it? The other in me. It's the other in me. So do we really integrate this other Is that it, Guilherme? Would you like to contribute?
Aqui é basicamente isso, né?
I think, yeah, it's basically this.
Acho que é um insight seu,
It was your insight, an insight of yours, this idea of the programs listening. But I was always wondering and trying to bring also the cultural complexes. I was trying to think,
na cabeça. Deixa eu tentar sintetizar.
I have so many things in my head, I'm going to try to summarize.
Questão que eu acho que está presente no Rio,
That it's also an issue
psicoterapia,
that it's present in the 100-year psychotherapy of Hillman.
nosso contexto brasileiro,
And in our Brazilian context, we were trying to sensibilize a little bit more for this issue.
a gente vive numa sociedade
As I said, we live in a very unequal and violent society.
e muitas vezes o trabalho do
And many times, the work of the psychotherapist in the individual setting, in a private room, in a private place, workplace, is as if you kind of, when you have two persons there of a more privileged social class, as if we kind of eliminate all these problems that surround us, all this pulverized blood in the air that we have in the Brazilian societies remains outside the consulting room. But we cannot keep it outside. I don't know if I'm clear enough, but I think it's very important what Carmen brings from the Bantu people. We could bring other things. The Yanomamis, people here in Brazil, they are having very important and interesting contribution. I think anthropology is very connected to this. And how we manage to work with this kind of cosmovision, with kind of world vision, that many times is radically different from the individualizing idea of the capitalism and the liberalism. But obviously, there's less power in this idea. And how we can listen to this and how this can be, in a way, present in the psychology. Because one of the challenges that really motivated us to offer a course in 2021 that became this book that Ludmila showed here. I think that the porous listening has to do with this, not to close that structure, our structure of work to only to what we know, to our colonized material. Is that okay? No, it's because I had an idea from what you were saying. I think it's a very simple idea, but that the listening is not porous, is when a Black patient arrives in our consulting room, he usually complains about racial violence that he was the victim of, and the analyst tells you cannot victimize yourself, you have to pull out your potential, and not understanding the reality that Black individuals suffers every day, that it's an universalism in this ways of thinking of what the patient suffered.
Thank you so much for explaining
Tem
a
uma
bit further.
questão. Desculpa.
Oh.
Tem uma
No,
questão.
sorry. There is a question in the chat. So
Exactly.
I'm going to take a
Yeah.
look.
Lisa.
I'm going to take a look and translate. Okay,
Please.
so it's Zarina Charlotte Hayes. She's asking, how can we as psychologists, how can we put into practice in our clinic this listening that leaves the individual and goes towards the collective, giving voice to questions that crosses the society? And if the work of the Aesthesis Collective has to do with all this, okay?
Uhum.
Não sei se vou começar a responder ou não.
Posso começar aqui, então?
Can I start answering?
Isa,
Okay.
muito obrigada pela pergunta, porque era uma coisa que eu queria super
Cesar, thank you very much for the
né?
question because that was something that I wanted to bring. So I'm going to take your question to present this. As Thesis Collective, we founded thinking in dealing with these issues, especially because we had a goal, a specific goal in this collective that we like to take psychology outside the consulting rooms and to bring the word to the consulting room, bringing these issues of the collective that cross our bodies for lives. So our idea, and I think that it has to do with admitting this historical cultural layer as founding in the psyche, the foundation of the substrate in the ontology. I think they are very important, as the myths are important for the archetypal reality. So we founded the collective with the idea of having a conversation rounds in which we could bring a person from the psychological field and a person from outside the psychological field, but it would be a scholar in the issue. So we brought people from the Black movements, talking about racism, some militants, of some activists of the LGBTQ plus movement to establish a dialogue as a conversation circle. So we started as acknowledging the importance of this in the Jungian field, because sometimes the Jungian psychology remains outside of the work. So we thought we should bring these questions and start to talk and put our theoretical framework there for the critics, these persons that are working with this, being activists and suffering in their skins. Some of these discussions that we had here, as he was saying, sometimes we thought that we would need more. So we proposed the course, 20 meetings, and then we wrote the book because we thought that this we needed more. We needed to listen more to people's demands, the people that were suffering this. Yes, perfectly. Perfect. I think it's exactly this. I imagine that she is referring to the individual clinic and how this process, I think this is always the issue. What do we do with all this? If we basically, I'm going to say something simple, but at the same time, I think it's fundamental. If we are more aware of our psychic place as white or black, indigenous, cis, trans, non-binary, I think that we depart from a place. We are listening based on a point of view. It cannot be different. But at the same time, you have to be aware of this place and the other's place. This idea that the trans is different, the black is different, is in our minds because of a very dominant cultural complex. So we have to deconstruct. As we deconstruct, we start having a more interesting way of listening. Different from what? This is the first question, right? Even if you were, for example, working with a white, cis, heterosexual man. Exactly. I think that is also a question from Mauricio that it goes in the same line. He asks, I mediated 3 weeks ago, an analytical class talking about the archetypes of the Umbanda, but the reaction of the students was very negative. How to put down these barriers and these walls. So look at the instauration of the stereotypes and the prejudices operating. So this religiosity of the religions of the Black population suffering prejudice. Sometimes I have some clients, I have some patients that say, well, I went, for example, to a candomblé, to a Umbanda session, which is the Black population religions usually, and they talk in a very discreet way, as if it was something inferior or something to be shamed about. Even in the information of this fact, the idea of the norm as something superior, and this really creates humanity, but it's not in this norm. It's worse, it's less valid, it's bad, it's not to be considered. I think that that's the only questions in the chat, Ludmila.
Okay. Are there any comments maybe that we want to read out loud for the English-speaking people with us, or something of interest? There's a new message, quite long, maybe.
Good evening. During the marvelous presentation, I understood that the issues that were approached, like a movement of decolonization and deracialization of the psychology in a wider sense, in the psychology and in the clinical, in the analytical psychology clinic, okay, in the specific field that was presented. So besides that, the porous listening can be extended to other fields, like the educational field. Okay.
Minha dúvida, posso fazer pergunta?
If you want to comment.
Yeah, he would
Please.
like to make a question. Because I have some curiosity. I don't know if a person would like to comment. If this is comprehensible for the non-Brazilian audience, if this problematic is similar in other places, in the places where these people come from, as I saw, I think the majority that we have here is of Brazilian population. I don't know, maybe if we have some other people here from outside Brazil that would like to comment on this.
It seems not so, but maybe, there is a hand. There is a hand, the hand of Norm. Norm, please.
Am I on?
You are.
Okay. Well, I'm calling from Montreal. There's a sentence in the translation that was interesting. You said that the white ego has to metaphorically die. I don't think it's the white ego that has to metaphorically die. It's an idea. Well, basically, it's money. The idea of money has to metaphorically die. And what is behind that is also Christianity. If you'll notice what has been going on in the world for the last 1700 years. I say 1700 years because Christianity started basically with Constantine. Before that, Christianity was just another Jewish sect. Okay, that's it.
thank you. Do one of you want to answer?
E aí, Livia, vamos matar o ego branco?
É que eu acho que a questão do ego
You
branco...
were saying that to kill the white ego. I think that this issue of the white ego, he puts this in a text. It needs to metaphorically die. And I think the idea of death here, and needs to die, is the idea that it has to leave the consciousness of light and to enter a more imaginal reality, the opposite of the positive, the negative in the sense of the opposite of what is manifest. It's a more psychological reality. A more psychological reality, a reality of the word of Hades, to leave what is manifested and to see in a more psychological way. I think that this is the death he's referring to. He's going to talk in the alchemical psychology, is that the black is this color that comes and disintegrates the center of the consciousness, what is known, and it's going to bring this consciousness to a more metaphorical level. So I think that this is the death he's referring to. It's not a death and it must be resurrected or something like that. No, it's not what he's referring to. Okay, Norm.
So if there are no more questions, comments, we are so on time. I would close today's Psychosocial Wednesday now. Thank you very much again, Carmen, Guilherme. It was so interesting, and I think it will echo with us for at least tonight and the next days. We will be back with Psychosocial Wednesdays on the 18th of October with Ilana Lack. She's an activist and analyst and activist from Israel. And she will talk about the power of a cultural complex in her home country. So until then, take care. Thanks for being with us. Have a great month and goodbye.